A strange discovery. Eric Maxwell had always been drawn to places with stories hidden in their walls. In the heart of the French Quarter, he often wandered down cobbled streets lined with shops overflowing with trinkets from forgotten times. But today was different. Just past a row of brightly lit windows filled with tourist souvenirs, a shop appeared out of nowhere. A dark, unassuming store wedged between a vendor selling cheap voodoo dolls and a shuttered jazz club. The sign, painted in faded, weathered gold, read Madame Leno's Curiosities. Eric paused, eyebrows raised in surprise. He was sure he'd never seen this place before. He'd roamed this part of town hundreds of times, yet this small storefront felt as if it had materialized overnight. Compelled by a blend of curiosity and intrigue, he pushed the door open, and a bell above chimed softly. The air inside was dense with the scent of incense and something else, something ancient and indescribable that made the hair on his arms prickle. Shadows clung to the corners, and every surface was cluttered with objects that seemed to hum with their own stories. Masks with hollow eyes, gilded mirrors, dusty books stacked haphazardly. The dim light glinted off the surfaces of the artifacts, casting odd reflections that danced around the room. As he took a step forward, it felt like walking into another world. "You're finally here," a voice called from behind a beaded curtain, startling him out of his thoughts. An elderly woman stepped out, wearing a wrap of deep indigo that framed her silver hair and piercing eyes. She moved with an otherworldly grace, as if each step were carefully calculated. There was a knowing look in her eyes, a kind of warmth mingled with mystery, as if she held secrets he could never begin to fathom. "You've been looking for something, haven't you?" she asked, her voice a strange mix of strength and softness. Eric managed a smile, though her gaze made him feel oddly vulnerable. "I'm a collector," he said, gesturing to the room around them. "Interesting pieces with stories behind them always draw me in." The woman's eyes twinkled with mischief as she seemed to consider him. "Then perhaps something is looking for you as well." Without another word, she turned and disappeared behind the counter. Moments later, she re-emerged holding a brass vessel that seemed to shimmer with an almost unnatural light. It was about the size of a wine bottle, and its surface was covered in engravings, complex, swirling patterns that seemed to shift subtly if he stared too long. "This vessel," she said, her voice reverent, "is one of the oldest treasures in this place. It's been waiting here a long time. Longer than I've been here, in fact." Eric took the vessel from her hands, feeling an inexplicable warmth emanating from it, as if it held some secret heat. "How much are you asking?" he asked, assuming the answer would be steep. The craftsmanship alone looked priceless. $20, she replied with a small smile. He almost dropped it in surprise. "This can't be worth just $20, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Some treasures choose their owners, Mr. Maxwell," she replied, wrapping the vessel in silk. "They have their own sense of value. Besides, they only reveal their worth to those who truly listen." Before he could protest further, she had already placed it in a small bag, and he found himself handing over the bill, almost in a trance. As he left the shop, a strange feeling washed over him, a mix of excitement and an unexplainable unease. It was as if a faint hum resonated from within the bag, a sound only he could hear, calling to him, urging him forward. Back in his apartment, Eric placed the vessel on his coffee table and regarded it with the intense curiosity only a true collector could understand. His small living room was a haven of artifacts from around the world, each piece holding its own story, its own whispers of the past. But something about this particular artifact was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had a story yet to be told, a tale bound tightly within its brass walls. "Well, let's see what you're hiding," he murmured to himself, pulling out a soft cloth to polish the vessel. As he carefully ran the cloth over the engraved surface, his thumb brushed over a particular groove that felt oddly warm, almost like skin. And then, as if he'd flipped an invisible switch, he heard a faint, metallic click. Before he could fully process the sound, a hum, low and steady, reverberated through his bones, filling the room with an energy that was palpable, electric. He stumbled backward, eyes wide as a mist of azure light began pouring from the mouth of the vessel. At first, it was only a trickle, but soon it erupted into a stream that filled the air with tiny, swirling motes of light, flickering like stars suspended in the darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as the mist began to take shape, solidifying into a figure, a woman who floated a few inches above the ground. Her dark hair cascaded in waves, as if caught in an unseen current, and she wore a glimmering bikini-like outfit that seemed woven from stardust itself. Bangles lined her wrists, chiming softly as she stretched her arms out, as if waking from a long slumber. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice a soft, lilting melody that resonated with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I was beginning to think I'd never get out of there." Her eyes, a strange, shimmering blend of honey and gold, fixed on him, and a smile spread across her face. "You must be my new master, though I have to say, you're far more attractive than the last one." For a moment, Eric was completely speechless, mouth hanging open as he struggled to process what he was seeing. Finally, he managed to stammer, I'm Eric Maxwell, and you're a Jenny." She landed gracefully, her bare feet touching the hardwood floor as she looked around his cluttered apartment with an amused smile. "My name is Syra, and yes, I suppose that's what you humans call us. But I prefer the term Jinn. It has a bit more mystique to it, don't you think?" Eric's mind raced as he took in the bizarre sight before him, and 1,000 questions leaped to the forefront. "Wait, you're real? Like, the whole genie in a bottle thing? The 3 wishes?" Syra nodded, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, it's real. But I wouldn't get too excited," she said, holding up a finger playfully. "The wishes don't always work out the way you think they will. I have my own interpretations. Makes things more interesting." The realization of what he was dealing with slowly dawned on him, and he forced himself to focus, trying to keep a clear head despite the surreal situation. "So, what now? I just make a wish, and you grant it." "More or less," she said, tilting her head as she examined his collection of artifacts with interest. Her fingers brushed over an African mask, an Asian scroll, a piece of pottery from South America. "Though I must say, you have quite an interesting taste. But enough about that. How about you make your first wish?" Eric hesitated, glancing around his apartment, suddenly feeling like he was on the edge of a precipice. His mind buzzed with possibilities, but he remembered Madame Leno's words. Some treasures choose their owners. It felt as if this moment had been building for far longer than he could comprehend, and he needed to tread carefully. After a pause, he looked up at her and said, "I wish to know the history of your vessel, where it came from and how it ended up here." Syra's eyes lit up, a flicker of admiration in her gaze. "Interesting choice. Most people go straight for fame or fortune, but history, that's something special." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel a strange warmth emanating from her, like the warmth of sunlight through clouds. She raised her hand, and the room around them began to shimmer, dissolving into a swirl of colors and shadows. Eric felt himself slipping into the unknown as the world he knew melted away, replaced by something ancient and far more mysterious. The tale of ages passed. Eric blinked, and the world shifted around him. Gone was the familiar setting of his cramped apartment. In its place was a vast desert under an expanse of stars that seemed close enough to touch. The air was warm and dry, scented with spices and something earthy, like old parchment. The sand under his feet glimmered in shades of silver and gold, stretching out into infinity. Beside him stood Syra, her eyes glowing with a faint golden light that danced as she looked at the ancient landscape. She seemed more at home here, more real somehow, as if the boundaries between her and the world had faded. "This," she said softly, gesturing to the endless desert around them, "is where my story begins." Eric looked around, entranced. The atmosphere was charged, as if the desert held centuries of secrets waiting to be uncovered. "How are we here? Is this a vision? Sarah smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. Think of it as a glimpse into the past. My magic allows us to travel through memories as if we were there. And believe me, this place has a lot to remember. As they walked through the dunes, a city began to materialize in the distance, illuminated by torchlight and the faint glow of moonlit domes. It was unlike anything Eric had ever seen: tall sandstone walls, intricate mosaics lining the gates, towering structures with minarets stretching toward the heavens. The city had a sense of grandeur, a faded glory that whispered of an era long past. This is Baghdad, Sarah explained. During the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, when scholars, artists, and dreamers flocked here from all over the world, knowledge was revered here, and magic, real magic, was not just myth. They approached the city gates, which were guarded by soldiers adorned in armor decorated with intricate patterns. Sarah led him through the bustling streets, filled with merchants hawking spices, silks, and jewels. The air was alive with the sounds of life, a tapestry of voices, laughter, and music woven together into a symphony. As they walked, Eric noticed Sarah glancing at the people around her, a fondness in her gaze. "So you were human once?" he asked, not wanting to break the spell of the scene, but unable to contain his curiosity. She nodded slowly. "I was once like any other in this world, a young woman with dreams of her own. But fate, it seems, had other plans." Her voice trailed off, her eyes distant, as if recalling memories she hadn't touched in centuries. They passed through an archway leading into a massive courtyard. In the center stood a workshop, alive with the sounds of hammering and the hiss of steam. Inside, an elderly craftsman with wrinkled, calloused hands was working on a brass vessel, identical to the one Eric now owned. He watched, mesmerized, as the craftsman carefully etched intricate geometric patterns into the vessel's surface, his movements precise, his focus unwavering. "This man," Sarah said, watching the craftsman with a look of quiet respect, was Al-Hakam, one of the finest metalworkers in the world. People traveled for days just to see his creations. His art was extraordinary, but he was also ambitious. He wanted to create a vessel that could capture something beyond human understanding. Magic. Eric guessed, his voice filled with awe. Yes, but more than that, he wanted to channel the mysteries of the universe itself: time, energy, dimensions. He wasn't trying to create just a beautiful object. He wanted to open a door. As she spoke, the craftsman completed his work, stepping back to admire the vessel. It shimmered in the dim light, the engraved patterns seeming to move with a life of their own. Al-Hakam raised his hands, chanting words in a language Eric couldn't understand. He watched, entranced, as a spark of light traveled from the craftsman's fingertips and sank into the vessel. The air around them shifted, vibrating with a strange energy, and a faint azure glow began to pulse from within the vessel's depths. The scene shifted abruptly, and Eric found himself inside a grand palace, where Al-Hakam was presenting his creation to a robed figure who sat on a throne surrounded by advisors. The ruler's gaze was sharp, assessing, as he examined the vessel, nodding with approval. Al-Hakam was favored by the Caliph, Sarah explained. But what neither of them knew was that his creation was far more powerful than either could understand. It wasn't just a container, it was a prison, a doorway. It had the power to bind spirits from other realms. At that moment, the palace erupted in chaos. The vessel, seemingly of its own accord, began to glow with an intense light, blinding everyone in the room. The ground shook as an otherworldly wind filled the hall, sending tapestries fluttering and torches extinguishing in bursts of smoke. Eric turned to Sarah, his mind racing. "So, you were bound to the vessel." She nodded, her expression somber. The energy Al-Hakam channeled created a bridge between worlds. "I was caught in the crossfire, so to speak. I became the first to be bound, transformed from a mortal being into something different, a guardian, a djinn." The room shifted again, and Eric found himself on a bustling trade route. The vessel now in the hands of a merchant dressed in rich fabrics, his fingers adorned with rings that glittered in the sunlight. He passed it along to a woman in a crowded market, who in turn sold it to a nobleman boarding a ship. Each person seemed unaware of the power they held, treating the vessel as little more than a valuable artifact. For centuries I passed from hand to hand, Syra continued, her tone laced with sadness. Few ever dared to call on the power of the vessel, and those who did often wished for things that only brought more misery. Eric could feel the weight of those centuries in her voice. The loneliness, the frustration. "Did anyone ever set you free?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. She looked at him, a sad smile curving her lips. "Some tried. But the vessel is a binding stronger than any physical chain. It requires a very specific kind of wish, one that nobody has ever made." They moved through the centuries together, witnessing the vessel's journey across deserts, seas, and continents. Each time it changed hands, Syra's essence lay dormant within, waiting, observing, unable to intervene. She watched civilizations rise and fall, empires crumbling into dust, all from within the confines of her prison. Finally, they arrived in a dimly lit, narrow alley where the vessel was exchanged between a cloaked figure and a woman in dark robes. The woman had a sharp, intelligent gaze and carried herself with the poise of someone who knew the weight of the secrets she held. Eric immediately recognized her as Madame Leno. Madame Leno knew what the vessel was. Eric asked, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," Syra replied. She was one of the few who sensed its true nature. She kept it hidden for decades, waiting for the right person to find it. She believed that treasures, true treasures, find their owners, and she trusted that one day someone would come who wouldn't see the vessel as a mere object, but as something alive. They returned to his apartment, the weight of all they had seen settling around them. Eric looked at Syra, his heart heavy with the knowledge of her long imprisonment, the solitude that had defined her existence. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling the words fall short of what he truly wanted to express. She tilted her head, her smile both wary and hopeful. "Don't be, you're here now, and that in itself is something I've hoped for." They sat in silence for a while, the golden afternoon light casting soft shadows across the room. Despite everything, Eric felt a strange connection to her, a bond formed not just from their time together, but from the history they now shared. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, that she wasn't just a mythical creature bound to grant wishes. She was a being who had experienced centuries of human life, of hopes and disappointments, and she carried them all within her. And then, as if sensing his thoughts, she leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of challenge and vulnerability. "So, Eric Maxwell, now that you know my story, what will you do with your second wish?" Eric's mind raced with possibilities, each one more tempting than the last. But he knew, instinctively, that his next wish had to be something meaningful, something that acknowledged the weight of her existence, her history, and her hope. He took a deep breath, gazing into her eyes, and felt an idea take shape, a wish that would change both of their lives in ways he couldn't yet fathom. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the apartment trembled, a faint shimmer appearing around Syra, as if her very presence was beginning to destabilize the world around them. The artifacts on his shelves began to vibrate, a vase tipped over, and small sparks of golden light flickered around them, mirroring the intensity in Syra's gaze. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the words that would either bind them closer or tear them apart. With one last steadying breath, Eric spoke. "A dangerous wish." Eric's heart pounded as he felt the words forming, each one carrying a gravity he hadn't anticipated. Across from him, Syra's eyes shimmered with an almost fragile intensity, as if she, too, sensed the weight of his choice. "I wish." He paused, struggling to steady his voice. "I wish to experience your world, Syra. To see what you see, feel what you feel, to truly understand the universe from your perspective." The effect was immediate. The room around them darkened, the walls seeming to dissolve into shadows, as if his very wish had called forth a force lying dormant, waiting to be unleashed. Syra's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, a look of both awe and trepidation. For a moment, she appeared almost ethereal, as if caught between worlds, her form flickering with a light that bordered on the divine. "That is a wish I've never heard before," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability. "Are you certain, Eric? To enter my world is to cross boundaries you may never come back from. This wish, it's powerful, and it will change you." Eric nodded, the conviction in his heart steadying him. "I want to know you, Syra. Not just your story, but the way you see everything, through the eyes of a djinn. I don't want to just observe, I want to experience." She held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of hesitation, then reached out her hand, her fingers glowing with an azure light that pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. "Then let us step beyond," she said softly, her voice a mix of excitement and caution. Eric reached out, his hand slipping into hers, and in that instant, reality itself seemed to shatter. The world fell away, and Eric felt as if he were weightless, suspended in a void that hummed with energy. Colors he'd never seen before exploded around him, each shade rippling and dancing as though alive. He felt himself stretching, expanding, becoming something more than just flesh and bone. Syra's hand held him steady, grounding him as they drifted through a sea of stars that flickered with memories, her memories. They floated in a swirling cosmos of golden light and shadows, each fragment a scene from a life beyond human comprehension. He felt the sands of ancient deserts slipping through his fingers, saw towering cities that no longer existed, and heard the laughter of people who had faded into history. Syra was sharing her essence with him, opening a doorway into the deepest parts of herself, and he could feel her emotions bleeding into him: joy, sorrow, longing, and a loneliness that stretched across centuries. "This is the in-between," she murmured, her voice echoing as if carried on the wind. "It's where jinn reside, a place where time and space are fluid." They floated closer, her presence wrapping around him like a warm embrace, and he realized that he could sense her emotions more clearly, almost as if they were his own. Her joy at sharing this part of herself with someone, tempered by the fear of what it might mean to let a human into her world. "I can feel what you're feeling," he whispered, wonder filling his voice. "Your thoughts, your memories, it's overwhelming but beautiful." Syra's gaze softened, her eyes reflecting countless galaxies. "Be careful, Eric. The in-between is enchanting, but it has a way of consuming those who linger too long." They drifted through realms that defied human understanding. One moment, they stood in a crystalline forest, where the trees sparkled with colors not found in the physical world. The next, they were surrounded by floating islands of light, each containing echoes of different dimensions. Eric's senses were heightened to a degree he could hardly comprehend, and he felt as if he was seeing the universe through 1,000 different lenses, each one offering a new perspective, a new way to perceive reality. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined," he murmured, awe dripping from his words as he reached out, watching his fingers leave trails of golden light in their wake. Syra floated beside him, her expression thoughtful, almost somber. "For us jinn, this is home, but it is also a prison of sorts. We exist here, yet we're bound to the mortal realm, tied to vessels, to wishes. We're eternally caught between dimensions, never fully belonging to either." Eric felt a pang of sadness ripple through him, realizing the depth of her isolation. "Is this what you feel all the time?" "Yes," she replied, her voice a soft murmur. "Humans see us as powerful, otherworldly beings, but they don't realize the weight of our existence. We are bound by rules, shackled by limitations imposed by magic and mortal desires. It's rare that anyone would want to understand that side of us." They drifted toward a new realm, a vast expanse of endless mirrors suspended in an ethereal fog. Each mirror reflected a different version of Syra, a young girl, a regal woman in royal attire, a fierce warrior wielding an ancient blade. Eric could feel her past echoing through each reflection, fragments of identities she had worn and shed over the centuries. "This is where memories reside," she explained, a wistful look in her eyes as she glanced at her many reflections. "Each version of me, shaped by different eras, different wishes, different masters. Some were kind, others, not so much." Eric reached out, his fingers brushing against one of the mirrors, and a flash of memory surged into him. He saw Sarah as a young woman, full of hope and wonder, bound for the first time by the magic of the vessel. He felt her terror, her sorrow, her realization that her life would never again be her own. The weight of it pressed down on him, and he pulled his hand back, his heart aching with empathy. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You don't have to carry that sorrow, Eric. It's mine to bear. But thank you for seeing me as more than just a djinn." They continued through the in-between, through landscapes that shifted with each step, crimson seas filled with floating orbs of light, stone pillars that reached beyond the sky, endless stairways spiraling through clouds. The worlds blended together, forming an ever-changing tapestry of colors and sensations that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Eventually, they came to a vast river of stars, flowing through a valley of crystalline mountains. Sarah motioned for him to sit beside her on a ledge overlooking the cosmic river, and he settled beside her, feeling the strange energy of the place thrumming beneath him. "This is my favorite spot," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "A place to remember that even though we're bound, there's beauty in this existence." Eric watched the stars flow like water, carrying whispers of forgotten dreams, half-formed wishes, and fragments of countless lives. He realized for the first time that he wasn't just seeing her world, he was part of it, woven into its fabric through the wish he had made. The moment hung heavy, and he felt a pull, a longing to reach out to her, to bridge the chasm between them. "Sarah, I don't want this to end," he said, the words slipping from him almost unbidden. "Being here, seeing all of this, being with you." She looked at him, her expression conflicted. "Eric, this connection we're forming, it's powerful, yes, but it's also dangerous. For both of us." "Why?" he asked, leaning closer, his heart pounding with something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Because, for a djinn to truly bond with a human, it creates a paradox. Our energies aren't meant to mix. It could lead to complications." Her voice was tinged with an unspoken fear, as if she were holding back something that weighed heavily on her. Eric felt a pang of frustration, but he forced himself to be calm. "Then what if I use my last wish to free you? Wouldn't that solve the problem?" She shook her head slowly, a sorrowful look in her eyes. "I wish it were that simple. Breaking the bond that binds me requires a sacrifice, one that would cost you dearly. The magic that holds us djinn is woven into the fabric of existence itself. Breaking it could unravel reality." He fell silent, the enormity of her words settling over him. He realized, with a strange sense of despair, that the more he understood her world, the more impossible their connection seemed. And yet, he couldn't deny the bond that had grown between them, an unspoken connection that defied logic or reason. Sarah touched his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Thank you for this wish, Eric, for letting me show you my world. But I fear that if we go any further, we may both lose something we can never regain." Eric looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I don't care about the risks, Sarah. I care about you. And I don't want to go back to a life where I don't know you like this." A faint smile touched her lips, and she squeezed his hand. "You humans," she murmured, half amused, half sad. "Always so willing to throw yourselves into the unknown." They sat in silence, watching the river of stars flow beneath them, the boundaries between them fading with each passing moment. And as Eric held her hand, he knew that whatever happened next, whatever sacrifices or consequences awaited them, he would face it all, as long as she was by his side. Boundaries of fate. Back in his apartment, Eric felt a heaviness settle over him, as if returning to the tangible world had drawn a veil over the wonders he'd just seen. The sights, the emotions. Cyrus's world still lingered in his mind, filling him with a restless energy. But as he glanced around his living room, he noticed something unsettling. Objects on his shelves floated a few inches off their surfaces, casting soft, otherworldly shadows. The air shimmered faintly with the same golden light he'd seen in the in-between. Sora was pacing, her expression troubled as she scanned the room. "Eric, your wish has left a mark," she said, gesturing to the subtle distortions. "You now carry part of my essence. It's like a tether, drawing my world closer to yours." He looked at his hands, noticing faint trails of cold light that dissipated as he moved. He was both amazed and unnerved. "So, we're connected." "More than connected," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a quiet intensity. "Your wish has fused our energies. You're not just seeing my world, Eric. You're reshaping reality around you to align with it. This is why humans and jinn were never meant to bond this deeply. Our existence is a paradox, and the universe, it doesn't like paradoxes." Her words were a warning, but Eric's curiosity and determination overpowered his caution. "Then what if we just let it be? Live between worlds? Maybe that's the solution." Sora gave him a sad, knowing smile. "The universe isn't so forgiving, Eric. It has a way of correcting such anomalies. If we continue like this, the forces that govern reality will tear us apart, one way or another. Or worse, both our worlds could collapse into each other." As if to emphasize her point, the walls of his apartment trembled, and a faint crack appeared on the ceiling. Through it, he could see a glimpse of swirling stars, as though a portal had opened to the cosmos. Books floated off the shelves, drifting through the air like paper feathers. The energy in the room felt charged, as though it were teetering on the edge of transformation or destruction. "Syra," he said, looking at her with a mixture of defiance and desperation, "there has to be another way. A way for us to stay connected without risking everything." She sighed, glancing at him with an expression that was both affectionate and weary. "There is one way, but it's risky and painful." Eric felt his chest tighten with both hope and apprehension. "Tell me." Sora took a deep breath, her gaze steady, but filled with the weight of centuries. "The only way to stabilize our connection is through a binding ritual, a deep magic that hasn't been attempted in eons. It would weave our lives together permanently, but it would mean giving up certain parts of ourselves. Pieces that make us who we are." Eric stared at her, realization dawning in his eyes. "You mean we'd lose parts of our memories, of our pasts?" "Yes," she replied sullenly. "The ritual would anchor us by removing the parts of us that create the paradox. The memories, the pieces that bind us to different worlds. It would let us exist, but at the cost of losing pieces of ourselves, forever." He was silent for a moment, the gravity of her words sinking in. How could he give up pieces of himself, his memories, his identity, to exist with her in a world that neither fully belonged to? And yet, how could he live without her, now that he knew her, now that he had seen her world? Syra's voice was gentle as she continued, as if sensing his inner turmoil. "I don't ask this lightly, Eric. I've existed for centuries, carrying fragments of other lives, other wishes. I would willingly give up pieces of that if it meant I could be with you, even for a little while." He looked at her, heart aching at the idea of her sacrifice, of what she'd already endured over lifetimes. And then, with a clarity he hadn't expected, he knew his answer. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'm willing to give up memories if it means we can be together." Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise and gratitude crossing her face. You give up parts of yourself, just to be with me?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "You're worth it, Syra. I don't care what it costs." She reached out, her hand brushing his cheek in a gesture that felt almost reverent. "Then we'll need to prepare. The ritual must be done in the in-between, where the fabric of reality is thinner. But once it starts, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain?" He nodded, unflinching. I've never been more certain of anything. They returned to the in-between, the world around them morphing as they stepped through the veil. The shifting landscapes, crystalline trees, floating islands, rivers of stars, felt familiar now, like an extension of himself. They stopped at the edge of a vast expanse, where the ground dissolved into mist, and Syrah drew a circle in the air with her fingers. Azure and golden light burst forth, forming symbols that hovered around them, ancient runes that pulsed with an energy he could feel in his bones. Once I begin the ritual, we'll each need to focus on the memories we're willing to release, she said. It will feel painful, like tearing away a piece of yourself. But once the magic takes hold, those pieces will fade, and our energies will bind. Eric took a deep breath, grounding himself in the presence of her hand holding his. I understand. She gave him a faint, bittersweet smile. Goodbye, Eric Maxwell, she murmured, her voice laced with a sorrow that felt like the ache of centuries. And thank you. Before he could respond, Syrah raised her arms, and the runes began to swirl around them, creating a vortex of light and shadow. The air buzzed with an intensity that made his skin prickle, and a strange warmth spread through him, filling him with a sense of both anticipation and dread. Eric closed his eyes, focusing on the memories he was willing to give up. He thought of fragments from his childhood, the small, inconsequential moments, the memories that, while dear, did not define him. He could feel them slipping away, unraveling like threads in the wind. But as the ritual deepened, the magic reached for more, tugging at the parts of him that were tied to his sense of self, his passions, his dreams. He felt a flash of his first love, the exhilaration of his first travel, and even the sense of wonder that had driven him to become a collector in the first place. Pain blossomed in his chest as these memories were pulled away, like vines uprooted from the depths of his soul. He held tight, clinging to the essence of who he was, desperate to keep some anchor, some remnant of himself. But as the ritual neared its climax, he felt a sharp pang of loss, a hollowing out of his past that left him feeling unmoored, as if drifting without a tether. Through the haze of his fading memories, he saw Syrah, her expression mirroring his own pain, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a fierce, unyielding love. And then it was over. The light faded, the runes dissolving into the mist, and a silence fell over them, heavy and profound. Eric blinked, disoriented, his mind feeling both lighter and emptier, as if pieces of him had been stripped away, leaving a strange, aching void. He looked at Syrah, trying to remember everything that had just happened, but certain fragments felt distant, as though seen through fogged glass. Syrah's gaze met his, her own eyes tinged with sadness, yet glowing with a soft warmth. She took his hand, her fingers weaving between his, and he felt a strange comfort in the touch, a reminder of the bond they now shared, stronger than memory or past. How do you feel? She asked, her voice tentative, as if fearing the answer. He tried to speak, his words slow, like he was learning to express himself anew. I feel lighter, and like I've lost something I can't quite name. But I also feel, he looked at her, a spark of recognition in his eyes. Whole, connected. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Then the ritual worked. Our lives, our energies are bound now. We'll exist here, in this world between worlds together. As she spoke, the landscape around them shifted, responding to their shared presence. The endless fields of mirrors became lush, filled with vibrant flowers that glowed with the same golden and azure light that had tied them together. Stars swirled above, and the ground beneath them shimmered, as if the in-between itself had accepted them as part of its tapestry. Eric felt a strange calm settle over him, a quiet certainty that, despite the sacrifice, he had made the right choice. He had lost pieces of his past, fragments of his life, but he had gained something far greater, a connection, a love that transcended the limitations of any one world. He pulled Syrah close, his hand resting on the small of her back as he looked into her eyes, seeing both the beauty and the burden of centuries. We did it, he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Yes, she replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin, leaving trails of light in their wake. And for as long as this universe allows, we will be together. In the silence that followed, they stood in the heart of the in-between, bound not by wishes or magic alone, but by a love that defied time, space, and the very fabric of reality itself. And as the stars danced around them, their souls intertwined, Eric knew that whatever they had lost, whatever pieces had faded into the void, were worth the life they had gained, an eternity together, beyond the reach of fate or memory. Here, in a realm where reality had no limits, they were finally truly free. The price of eternity. The in-between, with its shifting landscapes and endless starlit rivers, had become Eric and Sarah's new home, a place where they were bound to each other by magic and memory, tethered by a sacrifice that had reshaped their lives. The realm was serene, with skies that morphed from the pink of dawn to the dark blue of twilight, stars blinking in and out like silent witnesses to their story. Here, time didn't move in the way Eric was used to. Hours, days, perhaps even years blended together into a seamless experience. Yet a gnawing thought had taken root in his mind, a feeling that something was missing, something he couldn't quite name. He remembered fragments of his life before the ritual, glimpses of faces, echoes of laughter, and shadows of emotions that felt out of reach, like pieces of a forgotten dream. He sensed Sarah's memories intertwined with his own, their lives bound by the magic that held them together. It was beautiful, but the very act of sacrifice had left a void, a cost he hadn't fully understood. Sarah noticed his distant gaze as they sat on the edge of a floating island, a sea of clouds swirling below them. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked softly, her hand resting on his, grounding him to the present. He looked at her, searching her face, his expression both hopeful and uncertain. "I don't want to sound ungrateful, but yes, I feel like I'm reaching for something just out of sight, something that used to be part of me. It's as if parts of my past are hollow." Sarah's eyes held a mixture of empathy and understanding. She knew the price of eternity, the way time eroded even the deepest memories, reshaping them into fragments, shadows of what once was. It's the nature of sacrifice, Eric. Magic demands balance. When we bound ourselves, we gave up parts of our pasts to stabilize its reality. Those memories are gone because they were what held us to the worlds we came from. Eric nodded slowly, absorbing her words, but he couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered. "I just wish I could remember more of what it felt like to be whole." Sarah brushed her fingers across his cheek, leaving a faint trail of golden light. "I understand. It's the hardest part of what we've done. The in-between offers us an existence free from time and decay, but it demands a different kind of price. Our memories fade, gradually blending into the ether." Eric leaned back, staring into the swirling skies above them. "So we just drift here, forever, without memories, without our pasts?" "No," she said gently, her gaze unwavering. "We create new memories. We explore, we discover. We don't have to be bound by what we've lost. We can make something more." The promise in her voice gave him a strange comfort, a spark of hope in a reality that seemed vast and unending. Together, they began to explore the mysteries of the in-between, wandering through realms that defied logic and form, filled with creatures that shimmered like light refracted through a prism. They discovered fields of luminescent flowers that bloomed with memories, rivers that carried echoes of ancient voices, and mountains that whispered secrets of worlds lost to time. One day, as they walked through a forest where each tree glowed with the light of a different star, Sarah stopped, her gaze drawn to a particularly bright cluster of light filtering through the branches. It cast shadows that formed images on the ground, scenes of people, places, and moments that seemed achingly familiar yet elusive. Eric followed her gaze, watching as a scene materialized in the dappled shadows, a figure, younger, reaching out to something, his expression filled with hope. A name hovered in his mind, slipping just out of reach. He glanced at Sarah, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a memory," she said, tracing a line in the light with her finger. Sometimes, the in-between reflects what lies deep in our hearts, showing us fragments of the past we thought we'd lost. A pang of longing surged through him, and he reached out to touch the shadow, feeling a faint warmth as the image sharpened. He could see himself laughing, standing in a city square under a bright sky, a feeling of joy and freedom radiating from him. "I don't remember this," he murmured, his voice tinged with sadness. "But it feels important." Syra placed her hand over his, her touch steady and reassuring. "It's a part of you, Eric. A fragment of the life you once lived. The in-between is not always kind, but sometimes it gives back pieces of what it has taken." They continued on their journey, and as they moved through the in-between, more fragments began to surface. Memories floated up like scattered leaves caught in a breeze. The warmth of a sunset, the sound of laughter, the touch of rain on his face. They were flashes, brief and fragmented, but they filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. Over time, they grew adept at finding these memories, learning to navigate the realms of the in-between to recover fragments of their lost pasts. They would follow trails of light through valleys of mist, cross rivers that mirrored their reflections with shades of the people they had been, and traverse fields where memories bloomed like wildflowers, glowing with the faint warmth of nostalgia. Through their shared journey, Eric felt his bond with Syra deepen. Their shared sacrifice had stripped them of their histories, but in the absence of their pasts, they found solace in each other, in the unspoken connection that had transcended time and space. Yet, as the years passed, Eric sensed a shift, a strange, haunting presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. He often felt a pair of eyes following them, a cold prickle running down his spine. Sometimes he caught glimpses of a figure out of the corner of his eye, a man cloaked in darkness, standing just beyond the light. Syra, too, felt the presence, her gaze often darting to the shadows, her expression tense. One evening, as they rested by a pool that reflected the night sky, Eric finally voiced the question that had been growing in his mind. "Syra, do you feel it too? There's someone watching us." She nodded, her face clouded with worry. "I had hoped it was just my imagination, but you're right. There's a presence here that doesn't belong. Something from the outer edges of the in-between." Eric's curiosity stirred, mixed with a healthy dose of caution. "What do you think it is?" "I fear it may be the consequence of our bond," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "A shadow of the price we paid to stay here together. Magic like ours, binding two worlds, it attracts attention from entities that exist in the spaces beyond." The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Entities. "Not all realms in the in-between are welcoming," she explained, her gaze distant. "Some hold beings that feed on the memories and emotions of others, consuming them to strengthen their own existence." Eric's heart raced as he processed her words. "So this shadow, it's feeding on us, on our memories." She nodded. "It's possible. It may be drawn to us because we are different, bound by a paradox that defies the natural order." They remained vigilant after that, always wary of the shadow that lurked in the periphery. It grew bolder over time, and they could feel it drawing closer, like a predator stalking its prey. One night, as they walked through a valley of crystalline stones that sang when touched, the shadow finally revealed itself. A figure stepped out from the darkness, tall and cloaked in a shifting black mist that seemed to absorb all light. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red, filled with an insatiable hunger. "You have what doesn't belong to you," it hissed, its voice a cold, raspy echo that reverberated through the valley. "The bond between worlds, it's an affront to the natural order." Eric moved protectively in front of Syra, his jaw clenched. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The shadow tilted its head, its gaze fixed on Eric with a predatory intensity. "I am a keeper of balance, a guardian of the in-between. Your presence here disrupts the flow. The memories you've lost, the paradox you've created, they belong to me now. Cyrus' hand found Eric's, and he felt a surge of strength flow through him. We will not surrender to you, she said, her voice defiant. Our memories may be fragmented, but they are ours. This bond is our choice. The keeper's eyes flashed with a dark amusement. You cannot defy the will of the in-between. Either release what you have taken, or face the consequences. Eric tightened his grip on Cyrus' hand, a fierce determination rising within him. Then we'll face them together. The keeper lunged, its form shifting into a dark, twisting mass that descended upon them. Eric felt a wave of cold sweep over him, sapping his strength, filling his mind with shadows. Memories began to fade, slipping from his grasp as the entity fed on the fragments of his past. But Surah, her essence intertwined with his, summoned a surge of golden light, surrounding them in a protective barrier. The keeper recoiled, hissing in fury, but it was relentless, battering against the barrier with a dark force that seemed to swallow all hope. Eric, Surah whispered, her voice strained. The only way to stop it is to accept the full cost of our bond, to give up everything we once were. Our pasts, our memories, even our sense of self. He looked into her eyes, understanding the depth of her sacrifice, and nodded. As long as we're together. They closed their eyes, focusing on each other, letting go of the last fragments of their pasts. The memories faded, slipping into the void, but in their place, a new sense of purpose filled them, a unity that transcended time and memory. The keeper's darkness dissolved, consumed by the light of their bond, leaving only silence. When they opened their eyes, the valley was empty, the shadow gone, and they stood together, bound by a love that needed no memories, no past, only each other.